Sir. Good afternoon. Now you can hear me? Okay, great. Thanks for joining, everyone. It's a beautiful day outside. And please help me in welcoming Kristina Hill. We're so happy to have her here with us. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction. Kristina is an associate professor and research director of the Institute for Urban and Regional Development at the University of California, Berkeley. She's well known for her research on sea level rise and design strategies for adaptation to coastal flooding. Her work identifies synergies between infrastructure investments, biodiversity, and environmental justice. Kristina's book, Ecology and Design, Frameworks for Learning, published in 2002, I was going to bring my copy, but I don't have it with me, was groundbreaking, charting a course forward for design disciplines that were grappling with the ecological turn. It remains a powerful resource as we continue to grapple with climate change adaptation. Following Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Kristina became a member of the Dutch-American engineering and design team that developed New Orleans' water management strategy. She continues to collaborate internationally to understand the potential for designs to help protect coastal communities as sea levels rise. She's contributed to adaptation plans for a diverse group of US cities, federal agencies, and the Rockefeller Foundation. Her current research is focused on adaptation and coastal design in the San Francisco Bay Area, with comparative studies in the US Mid-Atlantic, Europe, and Hawaii. Her recent paper published in the journal Earth's Future identified contaminated sites in the Bay Area that are exposed to rising groundwater near the coast. Kristina received her PhD from Harvard University. She previously taught at MIT, University of Washington in Seattle, and University of Virginia, where she served as chair of the Landscape Architecture Department. She's been honored as a fellow of the American Design Institute in New York and as a Fulbright scholar. Please help me in welcoming Kristina Hill.
Thanks. Okay, usually I am loud enough to be heard. Can I be heard? Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to talk today about how sea level is rising, because if I don't tell you, who's going to tell you, right? I don't think you probably have someone come in every week and talk about the latest. I've just come off of the California State Sea Level Rise Task Force, which is assembled every 5 years to reevaluate the science and come up with what the state of California wants you to know if you're spending a lot of money on public projects. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that as I go, but that's my motivation. And I'm starting with this old piece of carving that changed its position relative to the sea, partly because of earthquakes and partly because of sea level rise, because I want to talk about time. Because I could give you a number for sea level rise, but it's not sinking in. It's not working for us to just talk about the numbers. I am going to tell the numbers, but I'm looking for ways to make this more understandable to people and for us to think about how humans have gone through some of these things before. So that was a sphinx, which is a hybrid animal, right? Part human, part lion. And I'll talk more about hybrids, but I also wanted to show this. This is the first seawall that archaeologists think humans have ever built. And it's off the coast of what's now Israel, near Haifa. And it's from the Neolithic, from 7,000 years ago. And now it's under 10 plus feet of water. So a lot changed on our ancestors, who were trying to figure out how to keep the waves out of a village and constructed a 1/4 mile long seawall to try to do that 7,000 years ago. So we're not facing this for the first time. I also wanted to share a couple of illustrations I used to talk about time and emotion. And this happens to be a series of stills from a video that I pulled together about an avalanche. And what I like about the images is that you can see the avalanche coming in the left image. You can see a car on the road in front of you in the middle, and then that car is obscured. I don't know what happened to the car. But I know that seeing things in the distance, when you're driving, when Americans drive, we get in a special kind of head mode, especially for those long road trips. And looking ahead at the road and seeing what's coming is really important. It's telling us a story. We're part of that story. And looking ahead and seeing something disappear, I think is especially poignant, put in the context of the American relationship to the road, where the road might be a representation for time, future time. This is an older representation technique from 1957. It was used for talking about genetic change. It's called the epigenetic landscape model, and it shows two system states, A1 and B1, and A1 moves from a somewhat less, it's pretty stable, but it's not something you couldn't move the ball. You're supposed to think of this as like almost like a curved pool table, these ball and cup models for system states. And then when it gets down to the front here over time, it's in a deeper valley. And that deeper valley would take more energy to get the ball out, to push it to one side or the other. So that's a metaphor for system states where the system state may decline in value, but may be more resilient to change in a bad way or in a good way. So A1 is a system that becomes more resilient. So is B2. That's an outcome for system B1 that's more resilient but negative. And then B3 is more valuable and less resilient, teetering in relation to what kinds of influences come in. So that might be something to consider as another metaphor for how we can think about time and change in systems. I'm going to be focusing on these kinds of maps that come from our national science agencies, like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And NOAA and NASA have huge amounts of data. And that is what it takes to win the argument these days. You have to have huge amounts of data. And when you walk into a room with that amount of data, you win. So NASA walks into the meetings in California about what number we should use for sea level rise. And they are using NOAA and NASA data, and immediately everyone nods. Yep, that's what it's going to be. Yep, okay, we're going to go with those numbers. So for better and for worse, NASA and NOAA have a huge influence. These maps show, I should look at it here so I don't wander away from the mic here. These maps show actual historic change in sea level between, on the bottom image, 1990 and 2020, and the top image, 2010 and 2020. And you can see that the anomaly is increasing. The amount of divergence from historic sea levels is changing more over time. And that your situation on the coast of Texas, not that we're on the coast of Texas, but Texas coast is going to see more, has already seen more rise in sea level than most places around the country. So you're seeing probably twice as much as California over the last 20 years. And all those red areas are seeing more sea level rise. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is, why is it rising in such an uneven pattern? Why is it so lumpy? Who knew the ocean was lumpy? I thought water kind of found its level and was flat. No, it's not the case. So the people from NASA walked in this year, last calendar year actually, to California and said, we think you've been using the wrong estimate, because last time in 2018, California used this trend, that's that dashed black line on the top there. It was called the H++. Sounds bad, H++. And it was meant to represent the observations that as ice shelves melt, ice sheets can melt very rapidly and catastrophically. through a phenomenon called marine ice cliff instability, MICI. Everything has a nickname. All acronyms are pronounced. So MICI is the scary thing that could happen if ice shelves melt, then ice sheets can break off in big 900-foot tall chunks. And that's scary to a lot of people. It's a mechanism by which the ice sheets in Antarctica could disappear very rapidly. So NASA came in and said, we think that number is too big. We haven't been able to show any mechanisms that could get us to 10 plus feet by 2100. So they said, well, we think that's too high. 10.2 feet by 2100, you know, and there were people in California who ran public agencies like San Francisco Public Utilities, which is a very wealthy, relatively speaking, a very well-funded public agency. They do projects in the, you know, that cost in the billions of dollars. They thought that California was a laughingstock for using that big number as one of the array of scenarios, not as the one, but as one of several. And California has been using an array of scenarios because what they're telling people in the public is, if you're building something that's meant to be permanent or is very expensive or affects a large number of people, then you have to choose the big numbers. And if you're building something like a portable restroom at a public park or paving a pathway at a coastal park, you can choose the low numbers. You don't have to build everything robustly for the highest possible sea level rise. So that's what they're talking about in California, is using these scenarios to link it to risk aversion. And then you get into these conversations about, well, is an African-American neighborhood in a low-lying area, is that meant to be permanent? Because there is no other place to move to, so people who live there think it's going to be permanent. And the state's saying, well, that's up to you at the city scale to figure out how you're going to resolve that. Anyway, there are these scenarios. The colored lines are NASA's new lines. And what I wanted to share about this in terms of time is that when we were talking about that H++ scenario, people's brains melted because they realized that we didn't have enough time to get ready. I actually had the head of a public agency call me in my little office at Berkeley and say, well, if that's what's going to happen, then wetlands are out. We will not be able to use tidal marshes to adapt. There'll be no nature-based anything. We need walls. Because we were talking about every 40 years seeing a change that could be 4 feet between now and 2060, another 6.2 feet, so 10.2 feet by 2100, which I just showed you, another 8.5 feet in the next lift. And I'm representing a 40-year cycle because that's usually how cities borrow money, on a 30 to 40-year cycle. Sometimes for really big things, you borrow on a 70-year time period for dams, for things that are meant to be truly permanent and generate a lot of benefits. But usually it's a 30 to 40-year cycle. So we worked with NASA and we saw all their data and we talked through all this anxiety we had about what could happen because we actually represented the public and we didn't want to know what's the most likely number for sea level rise. That's what the scientists all want to do. It's like they're playing darts and they want to hit the center. But we are trying to prevent anyone from being hit by those darts. So we're guarding the edges in the planning community. We're saying, wait a minute, if it could be very high, then we have to plan for what it could be, because that's going to affect people's real lives and property, but especially human safety. So we started talking about the upper boundaries of all these things. And so NASA added these kind of feathered ends to represent uncertainty, which is greater after 2100. There's a lot less certainty. In fact, there's less certainty after 2050. So we had them add these tails. And then we started talking about, okay, well, when do we get to 10.2 feet like we did in the H++? Oh, with this new data, we get an extra 18 years. So by 2118, we're at 10.2. I feel so much better. I have to tell you, I need a new nervous habit. I need to start smoking. Vaping. I'm an American. I don't smoke. I am asking European friends now to teach me how to smoke so that I will have a nervous habit that I can get through this with. The day these numbers come out, I'll show you another thing that just came out this year. Sometimes I actually have to go home from work. I don't know what to say to people. I say, okay, I'm taking a mental health day, I'm going home. It's really intense to think about the lifts again. So here are the lifts for the new high scenario. Again, thinking about how to imagine planning for the worst. And the reason why I think it's so important to plan ahead, at least 40 years, is because it's the CO2 of the people who have been living up to this point that has caused this problem, not the CO2 of the people who will live over the next 40 years. Of course, that adds to it. But we opened the barn doors and let the horse out by putting so much CO2 in the atmosphere. Between the 1980s and now, we doubled the American contribution to CO2 in the global atmosphere. So it's pretty intense what has happened in my adult lifetime. And that's why I think about these lifts that we'd have to do in sequence. I'm going to show you an example, and these are all additives. So when I showed 4.75 feet, I'm talking about adding that to 2 feet. So you can see people who are dancing around now congratulating themselves about how we're ready. We're ready for 2 feet of sea level rise, which is what's happening in coastal California. The airports are saying, oh, we'll just build a berm around the landing areas, the runways, and we'll be fine. There'll be no ocean on the runway. And I have reasons why that's not going to be fine, but that's the kind of thing they're doing. It's like we're filling all the cracks in the bathtub. That's the phase we're in. Going around doing special surveys, doing lots of vulnerability mapping, talking about what's going to happen in terms of, if the water comes in sideways, where will it go? And everyone's very self-congratulatory about levees, seawalls. The San Francisco seawall is being reconstructed, partly because that seawall functions like a belt on a beer belly. It's actually holding in more than it's keeping out, because the city washed its sand down to the wharves, built wharves on top of big piles of sand, and found that the sand leaked away. Surprise, surprise. So they built a seawall in what's essentially a pile of rubble with old ships sunk in it and everything, not world-class engineering, even for the 19th century. So they built this cockamamie seawall, and now they are rebuilding it, and it's going to cost somewhere around $13 billion. And if that number is being said in public, it's probably 25, 50% more than that. I'm from Boston. I saw the big dig. Let's be real. The number they say is smaller than what the final number will be. That's political suicide to say the final number. So they're building a long adaptive seawall. They want to get to 3.5 feet by 2040 and 7 feet by 2090. That's a nice ambition. And what does that look like? So this is, leaders in San Francisco, federal leaders like Nancy Pelosi, saying we need to be safe. We need to use big numbers, not use the minimum most likely number, but use these bigger numbers. So if we get the bigger scenario in our new conservative range of scenarios, they'll be looking good at 2040 if they actually get this built by 2040. I can guarantee you they will not get this built by 2040, not the whole thing. But if they did have it by 2040, they'd have a fair amount of headroom for the next lift. They would look good. At 7 feet by 2090, they have bought themselves 10 years before they would hit the trend and have to rebuild it. Now, a seawall, unlike an earthen levee, has a foundation. And when you need to take out the wall height is sized for the size of the foundation. So if you have to raise the wall, you don't just throw a few more courses on top, especially in a seismically active region. You have to take it out from the bottom and rebuild it So what they're telling us here is somewhere around 2080, the people who live in San Francisco are going to have to take out that wall and rebuild it. So I don't think that's intergenerational justice. I recognize it's a 70-year project. It probably has a 70-year life, better than nothing. But I want to know what they're going to do next, because this is an exponential change. And we have a hard time, we humans have a hard time grasping that the thing is going to accelerate from year to year. So this is actually the best time to come up with some kind of modular seawall that can be stacked and added to like blocks instead of something that has a foundation. But I haven't heard anything about that kind of innovation, so I don't think it's happening. And the question about which color feather we're on, I mean, I sort of think of them as roller coaster rides. You know, you've gone to the amusement park, you've bought the ticket, but you don't know if you're on the slightly scary kid roller coaster or the make your mother close her eyes and cling to the bar roller coaster, or the oh my God, never again roller coaster. We really don't know which roller coaster we've bought our ticket for, but we're in the seat and it's happening. The reason we don't know what roller coaster we're on is because we don't know how quickly Antarctic sea ice, the shelf, is going to melt. And if we look at the last couple of years, again, showing the data makes all the difference. This is updated in almost real time. This is from September 11th. Last year had a record low by a lot in how much sea ice there was in Antarctica. And this year has just hit that record low, has just ticked it, and is now, you know, moving away from it, but it could easily go down below it. So we're going to be watching to see, has there been a regime shift? Are we now on a new planet where there's going to be less shelf ice, and what will that do to the speed at which the Thwaites Glacier, and that's that red dot on the map on the left, that's the Thwaites Glacier, sometimes called the Doomsday Glacier, because it's like a cork in a bottle. And if the Thwaites Glacier goes, a huge area of glaciers will go that could lead us to as much as 11 feet of sea level rise, just from Antarctica, added on top of the other thing that's happening. So this paper just came out in January. It's by Eric Rigneau at UC Irvine. He has a lot of data. And he and his team have shown that tidal water is getting under the ice shelf and separating the glacier from the rock, separating the ice sheets from the grounding rock, much farther inland than they thought. And Antarctica is basically bowl-shaped in various points. So as the water comes in, more and more of it will come loose. And that could be the grease that sends that big area of ice out more quickly. So where I just spoke to that man from NASA on Tuesday, and he said, well, we don't have any mechanisms. He's telling my class, we don't have any mechanisms to explain how sea level rise could go up so quickly. This is actually one of those mechanisms that could do that. And models get updated slowly. Scientists are fairly conservative. A paper comes out, maybe 2 years later, the models get updated, if they get updated at all. There's a lot of investment in it. And the way that the reason why the sea rises differently around the planet is partly due to these thermohaline conveyor belts. I'm almost done with the science-y part, and I'm getting to the mic drop. So these thermohaline conveyor belts are the reason why Northern Europe may get colder in the next 50 years. If that loop shown in the Atlantic Ocean on the left breaks or slows down, then Europe will get a lot of Arctic air, and it'll be colder, and it'll eventually catch up, but to the point where you can't grow crops in some places. It could get a lot colder in a 50-year period and stay cold for 150 years, all being modeled even as we speak. So that's the reason why it's the ice forming, causing the water around it to get saltier, because the ice doesn't incorporate the salt. So the cold water next to the ice that's saltier drops down because it's more dense, and that starts the flow in the conveyor belt. And as the ice sheets incorporate less water, the ice shelf, I keep saying sheet, the floating ice, the ice shelf, as that incorporates less water, the conveyor belt slows. The motor that's driving it has less energy. So that's going to change currents around the world, and that's going to change where the ice goes. And in fact, they're using this idea of fingerprinting or sister ice to link cities to particular glaciers. So the cities that will be most affected by melting in Greenland are in the southern hemisphere. The cities that will be most affected by melting in Antarctica are in the northern hemisphere: New York, San Francisco, Hawaii. So that's weird and counterintuitive, but that's related to these changes that are happening in the currents. And this is just a reminder that we're seeing already as much as 2 feet, well, 2 feet of sea level rise is predicted for this region, Texas and the Gulf, by 2050. And the California coast will not feel as much as that. So it's a big difference in the Gulf Coast. So, okay, here comes the mic drop. I can't drop it because it's on my collar, but. This is the reason why everybody who's thinking about seawalls and levees is wrong, partly wrong. And that's because as the sea rises, coastal groundwater, that's not the stuff that's way down deep in some layer of limestone, but the stuff that comes from rain and slowly moves in the soil towards the ocean. When you dig down at the beach and you come to water, that's groundwater moving towards the ocean. And that's the stuff that's going to rise as the ocean rises, and including in the areas behind billion-dollar levees. It's going to rise. It comes from rain. It's going to rise. And another little known fact, the ocean kind of sticks its toe into the land. The salt water extends under the land in the groundwater. So there's a saltwater toe. And as the pressure of the sea increases, because it's a foot deeper or 2 feet deeper, it pushes that toe farther inland and wider, and so the freshwater groundwater lens has to go up. And let me tell you, we are counting on that not happening, because all of our cities have been built counting on a dry crust of land about 10 feet thick. So in coastal areas, we're going to see big changes that affect foundations, that affect contaminated sites where there's pollution in soil, that affect all of our pipes and infrastructure underground, that turn our rainwater swales into conveyance streams instead of infiltration opportunities. No sponge city, not going to happen, not in these places. So I became obsessed with thinking about where has this happened before, because I can't believe that we are the first human beings to face this. Luckily, the very first cities that were built 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, every time I say Mesopotamia, my wife does this, like, I don't want to know. I'm obsessed because I want to know how they lived with it. How did they live with this higher groundwater? Most of you, or many of you have probably seen maps that show that the Persian Gulf used to extend farther inland than it does now. And on the right is a series of map images that show how it went at about 15,000 years ago into that kind of tongue of space that went all the way to those old cities like Ur and almost to Uruk and to Lagash, which I'll show you some maps of, archaeological maps. So the Persian Gulf had this flat part at the end, and as the water came over a threshold, it kind of rushed into that flat part and got real big quickly. And that's the same for us today. If we have flat areas near the ocean, as soon as sea level rises above a threshold, very large areas can be flooded. So we have a similar problem with topography, where every region is a little bit different, and every part of every region is different. Here's the unexpected part. First, the sea rose. This is a cross-section through river valleys by some geomorphologist archaeologists. First the sea rose in the river valley. Then, because rainfall changed, like it is right now in Europe, we're seeing massive rainstorms in Europe this week, the valley filled in with sediment. And as the valley filled in with sediment, the rivers would more often flood their banks and create what are called natural levees or ridges on either side, which lead to sudden moments when the river, jumps its banks and comes out and changes course in this big flat delta landscape. And people were trying to live with that in towns that were all connected by boats because there were no cars and trains and airplanes. So they had to get everywhere by boat. Imagine you've invested everything in building a city. You're the leader of that city. You've chosen a god. I mean, you've put everything into it. And the river moves. Toast, all gone. No way to get there. You're off the beaten path. No trade, nothing. So this woman, young archaeologist Emily Hammer, has been using magnetic gradiometry, which identifies burned areas and areas in the soil where there were chemical changes to the soil. And without having to dig, they're able to look at large areas of land and see building foundations, streets, gate or wall pieces that are still in the ground under all the layers of desert that have built up on top now when it's dry. So they're able to actually see the city of Lagash. Kind of unbelievable from 4,000 years ago. And when they combine that with typical kind of aerial photography that lets you see where soils are wetter, they can actually see the streets, the city walls, the canals, the harbors, and the buildings. Mind blown. And when they see them, they see that what they think is a pattern that shows that the cities in that area were islands in the marshes, basically surrounded by part natural, part constructed channels. Not compact cities, but cities that were multi-nucleated across that wet landscape, people getting around by boat. Makes sense. And having to cope with flooding, a lot of flooding. They've tried to map it down to fine scale and compare, everything from the ditch you see in the magnetic radiometry to the ditch you see in the aerial photo. It's incredible to me that we can now see how people coped with high groundwater emerging from a map. What was the size of the different clusters they had? How many canals were there? They had, the Epic of Gilgamesh talks about the minister of canals. That the city had a minister of canals who was in charge of digging and maintaining, as you would think they would have to. This is a photo from the 1940s, but it shows an ancient technique, which was taking the reeds from the marshes in that Mesopotamian region. They're like big tule marshes that we have in California, rounded rushes, and bundling them into very long and thick bundles, and then using sticks and manpower to push them into place as a movable dam that could be opened and closed, so that when the water level was low, they could close it and cause the water behind it to rise and irrigate fields or let boats go to other channels. And then when the water was coming with a flood, they could open it, and the flood would do the rest of the work and open it the rest of the way. It's amazing what they were able to accomplish with human labor. And there are 4,000-year-old clay tablets that record how many bundles of reeds and men were sent to each area of this landscape. It's a wonderful paper by Stephanie Roast, who was at Stony Brook, and she's done this amazing review of the budgets to try to figure out where was all this happening? Where was this work happening under different royal eras? So not only did they have budgets for this and ministers for this, but they had a whole religion that focused on this. The god of the people of the city of Ur and Uruk was a god named Enki, who lived in the underworld, but not the dry underworld, not the hot, dry underworld of, Greek and Christian stories, but the groundwater underworld. That's where he lived. And their whole origin story is that people are born from the groundwater. It's kind of amazing. It makes me laugh. Born from the groundwater, live their lives on land, and then when they die, they go back to the groundwater. Whole different way of thinking. And the hybrid animal, like the Sphinx, that was important to the people of this part of Mesopotamia in that marshy delta was the sea goat, the goat fish. And that was an animal that would be smart like the goat. You get the brains of whatever animal is in the head, the front position, and you get the skills of whatever animal, the biological skills of whatever animal is in the back end. So able to swim, but smart and clever like a goat. And that evolved into the sign of Capricorn. For all you Capricorns out there, you come from the goat fish. So I get to do another mic drop, which is that contemporary cities are not ready for rising groundwater. And you can say that. You can walk into public meetings and say that in coastal cities, and it's true. It's true for almost every city you go to. Even if they're pumping, they're not ready. And the seawalls and levees will not protect them from this rising groundwater. So I have been going around showing people cartoons that I make in my spare time. And they look like this, where it's kind of my first degree is in geology, so I think in block diagrams. And that shows freshwater groundwater in the lighter blue, salty groundwater in the darker blue, underground infrastructure, a tidal marsh, a levee, a road, a dry creek because it's California and they're all dry most of the summer. Pollution that's been capped with a parking lot, because that's what we do. We mostly cap polluted soils. We don't remove the pollution, we put an umbrella over it so that the rain won't carry that pollution to new places. So we cap it. Over time, as the sea rises, that freshwater groundwater comes up into the waste underground that may be as deep as 10, 15 feet below the surface. It goes into that sewer pipe. It shows up in the creek bed. Over time, it floods the creek bed. The sewer pipe has no room for anything except the groundwater. And over time, it floods the road because our stormwater infrastructure that we've designed to carry rainwater away is the easiest path for water to rise up in. There's no friction. It just comes up through the void space of a pipe. Catch basins, inlets. It's all coming up that way. And you can see that at high tide in places like New York and San Francisco and Berkeley. It's already happening. We can see the groundwater come up. You're walking through a neighborhood and you see water in the gutter at high tide. Oh, what's that? A little piece of eelgrass or some kind of seaweed going by in the gutter. That is not a good sign. Seaweed in the gutter? No. Rust in the gutter where that high tide water comes up? That is not a good sign. That means salt water is in contact with building foundations, pipes. Now I'm going to tell you about something no one knows about. I'm going to be really surprised. If anybody's heard of this before, raise your hand, because I'm going to be super surprised. You're going to get an A at this lecture. The Geiben-Herzberg principle. Maybe if I pronounce it like the Dutch. The Geiben-Herzberg principle. Sound familiar? Someone's nodding. No. That is a little-known piece of 19th century Dutch observation that has appeared in 1960s textbooks, but has not been lab tested or field tracked very often. But what it says is, if you pump, and this lower image is showing a building with foundations in the groundwater that is pumping to protect its garage in the subsurface. If you pump 1 foot down the fresh groundwater, you will pull the saltwater boundary up as much as 40 feet. 1 to 40, vertical. And if you're in a coastal area, that saltwater boundary might be as much as 80, 100 feet down. You've just pulled it up 40 if you pump down 1. You pump down 3 feet, you've just pulled it up 120. So your building or your contaminated waste site or your sewage line is now in salt water. And the lifetime of a piece of concrete with metal in it in salt water is much shorter than the lifetime of a piece of concrete with metal in it under other circumstances where it's fresh water or dry. And many people think that the Florida condominium collapse from a few years ago, where almost 100 people died, that was a result in part of corrosion of those foundations as well as a design flaw. So that's really important for us in our seismic region to think about what might be chewing away. No one inspects foundations. If they did, they'd be able to put sacrificial metals in. There are things we can do. You can put a rod of zinc in the ground and it'll get all the salt ions. Good consulting opportunity for everyone in this room. Get out there, start talking about sacrificial metals. We're going to need them. So what are the alternatives to living in this crust of land that was dry and is now going to be soft and soggy and salty and unreliable, shake like a liquid in an earthquake? Because the higher the water table is, the more likely it is you'll see liquefaction. Well, it turns out not quite as old as Mesopotamia, but the city of Amsterdam, really good example of how to live with high groundwater. Dig a canal, pile the muck up on the blocks between the canals, and then do some light pumping to create positive pressure in the canal and pull the groundwater away. Wick it out of the adjacent blocks. Really smart. And you can see that the power they used for the pumping was less earlier. Those blocks are much closer together in the 17th century than they are later when you have diesel and other kinds of fuels that are being used to run the pumps. It makes a beautiful environment living with the groundwater. That's groundwater. Comes from rain, sits in the soil, goes to the ocean. And the new projects in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, also beautiful. These are prefabricated units where the lower, it's 3 stories. The lower floor is flotation, but it's also occupiable space, not a bedroom. Don't even think about that. That would be unsafe. But the lower floor is occupiable space, so it's 3-story buildings. Maybe some of you have seen these images. And what the next phase of this is, of the floating areas, these are prefabricated, tugboated into place, is to think about blocks. Now, this is not floating, but this is what it would look like if they built modular decking, pontoons underneath, and then stack prefab on top. That's what the Dutch are scheming about in Rotterdam right now. They are coming up with it. And it's not super hard. You just get flexible infrastructure joints for piping. It's stuff we do for houseboats already and in earthquake regions like mine. So we'll be talking about ponds that express the water table. That's the groundwater next to the ocean. It'll be brackish. There'll have to be tide gates. There's some mechanical component to it. But if the ocean comes over that dike, no harm, no foul. The platforms will just rise. If the dike breaks and the water goes out at low tide, you might end up canted in a funny position on that shared decking, but no loss of life. Maybe books have fallen out of a bookshelf, but no loss of life. Turns out there are other places that have done floating. Tenochtitlan, now known as Mexico City, also started as a floating district. I think the heaviest stuff was built on some islands that were already there, some rocky islands, but the surroundings of the residential districts were all floating, not unlike Mesopotamia, where you had your temples, your ziggurats, and then you had floating districts in the marsh. Reeds used to make homes, as well as to make dams. It's a fascinating technology, and the more I learn about how they put human waste in certain areas, certain compartments of the lake, and not in others, how they manage the roads to take them up for defense, to open them like drawbridges for defense and then close them again. It's amazingly sophisticated, and it's from our hemisphere. A truly indigenous American strategy. I talked to people in San Rafael's Canal District as part of my research work, and they are mostly from Mexico and Central America. They are proud. It's great to have something you can go to a community with that has felt mistreated and ignored and say, this is your culture's idea. So there are other things that we can do that I'm talking about in the Bay Area. No one is going to build this yet because we have a lot of permitting red tape and confusion right now trying to get ready for sea level rise. So it's not easy to build this stuff right now. But Rich Haig, landscape architect in Seattle, told me at lunch once while he was drawing all over the table, because he really did that, on a tablecloth. I was mortified with his ink pen. He said, the essence of landscape architecture is dig hole, make mound. There you are, master's degree. So if we dig hole on the inland side of a levee that has a marsh on it for habitat and for wave reduction, which is why we do them in the Bay Area, we can float in that pond. And while we do it, we can start to live a little bit more like healthy earthworms, where we cut out the soil for that pond, get rid of the contaminants, either treat them in our own region or sequester them in big concrete blocks. We can do it. Other places do it. Hamburg in Germany sequesters its own contaminants. So we make these ponds near tributaries with a big marsh edge, and we reduce the wave energy. But if a wave comes in, it's okay. Might be some path that gets damaged, but not too much. And when the tributary floods, this is the problem for levees and seawalls. They don't know what to do at a tributary. And in New Orleans, they build a campus-sized pump to deal with the tributary at the coast. Probably not something we all want to emulate. And then they pump the water over or through tide gates. But it's very mechanical, it's very expensive, and it's prone to failure because we do not maintain things. We, being Americans, don't maintain things. So I'm talking about something which is a kind of pond urbanism, jokingly called. And we called it Tidal City in a competition, and students did claymation to try to come up with public ways of explaining this, where they showed an existing creek. They did dig the hole. They showed a pond being constructed, make the mound, in this case more of a levee around it, fill it up with water, connect it to the creek, because you have to flush it. You have to let water in from the uphill side, and you have to let it out on the downhill side. And you have to let the tide water in, like it's breathing. This pond has to breathe the ocean in and then exhale it. And it has to be flushed by fresh water from above. And then it needs decking, shared decking, so that each little house is not tipping on its own. You share the balance of that. It's like a big snowshoe. You get space for public space in your floating if you have this shared decking, which houseboat communities don't really have. So they're showing examples of circulation, and we're trying to explain this to the public, basically. And how it might be used for stormwater management. These same areas in the Bay Area are flooding from rain events that are extreme, as well as flooding from sea level rise. So we're thinking about how to do that. We're thinking about how to illustrate it. This is one illustration. It includes a floating soccer field, because this is down by Palo Alto. Soccer is life. Football is life. And you have to have public spaces, so this one includes some crazy things. But it has a wide marsh, and then it has a levee, and then it has this pond mosaic at the bottom of what's a big slope, where all the water runs to the bottom of the hill. They're already pumping here 24/7, 365, So it's not a problem that's coming in the future. And then for that competition, we did a couple drawings where we did cross sections of what the ponds could look like, floating 3 stories, thinking about Hafen City, like in Hamburg in Germany, how could there be the mounding up on finger wharves and then building up higher on those. So you have both strategies in the same development. And then we go out and do little demonstrations to float things because people don't really understand how floating works. The whole displacement thing, the volume, the weight. So we go out and show people how floating works. And that's what I wanted to share with you. So I hope that gives you some sense that time connects us to our ancestors as well as the future, and that we have a lot to do to get some pilot projects going. Thank you.